Welcome to episode 28 of the Animorphs read-along broadcast. Today we are talking about book number 24, The Suspicion. This book definitely represents, I think, a pretty significant change of tone in comparison to the last maybe 6 or 7 books. We had, 16 and 19 and then the David trilogy and then the Hork-Bajir Chronicles and then book 23, the heartbreaking Tobias book. I think there's a distinct effort in this book to make it a little bit lighter and a little bit more cheerful because Lord knows the Animorphs need a break. This book introduces the infamous Helmicrons, the tiny alien race set on taking over the world, and they basically only exist for the sake of comedy. The Helmicrons are so small that Cassie actually initially mistakes their spaceship for a toy spaceship. When the Animorphs first encountered the Helmicrons, everything's very laughable and silly to them, but it turns out if they aren't a threat, then they are at least a pretty major annoyance. The Helmicrons have found the blue box. They were able to detect its energy signature, and they used their technology to shrink Marco, Cassie, and Tobias, and later also Jake and Rachel, down to their size. So for most of this book, Cassie and Marco are captives on board a Helmicron ship, pretty much at their mercy as far as getting them to return them to their normal size. What follows is a really silly sort of romp. The Yeerks end up getting involved. Visser 3 also gets shrunk down to size, and there's even a brief moment where the Animorphs and Visser 3 unite against their common enemy, the Helmicrons. In the end, Cassie morphs to Anteater and licks up all the Helmicrons and threatens to kill them if they won't return everyone to normal size. This book is clearly meant to be fun and silly, and it is fun and silly, but it is sometimes silly to a fault. A lot of the humor in this book lands, and I was laughing out loud at parts, but some of the humor doesn't quite stick. I'm all for fun stories, and I'm all for funny stories. I feel like the Animorphs' characterization was kind of sacrificed, and it was like all plot, no characters. Once again, the characters don't have to develop every book, but I do expect them to feel like their normal selves, and there was something just not quite right about the way the characters behaved in this book, and this is unfortunately a problem that's going to continue over the next 20 books or so, because a lot of them are going to be ghostwritten. I think in a lot of ways this book actually parallels book 14, which was the one where Cassie was narrating and they were investigating Zone 91, and there was a lot of silliness and fun and adventure in that book, and it was also very lighthearted, but I do think in some ways book 14 was a much more successful version of this story. Marco's obviously hysterical in this book, especially during the scene where he and Cassie are groveling for the dead Helmicron leader. It's pretty fantastic. Marco just kind of has a field day with it. The Helmicrons, of course, have all these weird rules in their society. Their leaders are always dead, and women are the ones in charge, men are the weak, submissive, sort of slave race. And there's probably some sort of commentary that to be drawn out of there, or maybe it was just all for fun, but I think this book spends a little bit too much time talking about how small they are and how big everything else was. I mean, the whole idea of being like that tiny is really cool and really interesting, but I feel like a third of the book was just like, I was so small that blah blah blah. And I'm just like, okay, we get it, you guys, like, we know you're tiny. Something about the pacing in this book also just felt a little off. I enjoyed this book and I laughed and I was looking forward to this book, but I do think it's one of the weaker books in the series, especially of the ones that are written by K.A. Applegate. It's not, a book of consequence, and it's certainly not one of the gems of the series, but overall I think the Helmicrons are pretty entertaining. I do, however, think this book sort of begins a lull or a decline in the series. It's not that the books go downhill from here, it's just that there's less consistency from here on out. There are going to be some amazing books in the next half of the series, but there are also going to be some weak ones, and I really feel like up to this point we haven't had that many weak stories, but we're getting into the middle of the series, and they've been doing this for a long time, and they're running out of ideas. There's still lots of greatness to come. There are going to be some rough patches ahead, but we're going to read through all of them. So yeah, those are my thoughts about Animorphs number 24, The Suspicion. The next book is number 25, The Extreme. If you want to keep up with this read-along, subscribe to this channel or follow me on Twitter, and I will see you on Thursday.